Okay, we're back for part 4. Great consciousness debate. Right in the middle of the IIT. They finally adjusted the camera. We can see Melanie Bali over here. They just asked her what she thinks the greatest objection was. We're talking about phi and all that stuff. So they're just about to switch the topic. So let's, it's right where I left it. Let's go ahead and see what's the question.
Right? But then at the same time, we heard from Victor that that is pseudoscience in some sense, because we can actually have full psychology of those terms. So how do you...
Wait, what? What?
And one of the things that IIT is different from the other theories, it starts from, we want theories to explain phenomenology.
Yeah, working on designing with Brian Adler training, the test of IIT. And it still is, yeah.
What about one of the, so we all agree that we want theories to explain phenomenology, and one of the things that IIT is different from the other theories, it starts from phenomenology, right? But then at the same time, we heard from Victor that that is pseudoscience in some sense, because we can actually have full psychology of those.
She said the word pseudoscience there. This was, when was this? 10 months ago? When was the IIT letter? When did that come out? Was that 10 months ago? Or was this before the letter came out? I thought, what the hell month is it? It's January. This was definitely before the letter came out, right? Letter came out over the summer and the fall. That was just a few months ago. Okay, anyway, so she said the word pseudoscience, and she said Victor said that this was pseudoscience. Because IIT does start with phenomenology, so to speak, with what they think consciousness involves, and then tries to mathematize that. So Victor said that was pseudoscience, even back there. I don't even know. Did he sign the letter? I know this is one of the main culprits right here. He's not one of the main culprits. That's not fair, but he's definitely like the first author of that letter. Poor Steve. Okay, so... this is pseudoscience in some sense because why?
Starts from phenomenology, right? But then at the same time, we heard from Victor.
By the way, I think you should start from phenomenology. Where else are you going to start?
That is pseudoscience in some sense, because we can actually have full psychology of those terms. So how do you make that?
I see. So yeah, false psychology of those terms. I think what she means. I don't know, did Victor say this somewhere in his talk or something? I didn't watch that part. It was all talks before, right? There was no debate or anything. I've been watching this whole thing. Okay. So, false psychology of those terms, like when we introspect, we might be wrong, and they're basing their whole theory of consciousness off of like some things that they think are pretty clearly obvious introspectively, like that consciousness is unified. As opposed to seeming to be unified, that it really is, and therefore this is an unification. It's an important part of what IIT tries to find. But is consciousness itself really unified? Some people take this to be obvious. Other people think it's not. So I think this is the sort of thing what he means by the false psychology of these terms. I don't know.
How do you address that criticism? Because in a sense, if we don't agree on that.
I think Victor and us, we have commonalities that we want to explore features of explain features of phenomenology, such as the binding, the unified aspects. Where we differ is that we say there are, 5 properties.
So she's saying that they agree because Victor wants to explain the unification of, this is a traditional property a problem in neuroscience called the binding problem, whereby we know that. To take a visual experience, the properties of the object are being processed by different areas in the brain that are distributed spatially around the brain. And then you combine that with so the visual area is around in this area, and then the auditory area, and then motor control and body sensing and all that. So these areas are located around the brain in different areas spatially. So how is it that we have an experience of the sunless tea, the color, the shape, bound together when these are in different parts of the brain? So Victor wants to explain that. IIT wants to explain that. I would say you could explain that and it could be unconscious perhaps. But that's a different question.
Unitary is one of them, but the structure, like these distinctions, relation, what I mean, that kind of information as a form, is something that we think is necessary to explain phenomenology. And I would say that not only it's important to test phenomenology in where the display is very busy and stimuli at threshold, but also we actually need to explain it in the other kind of more prominent situations of daily life where we see stimuli clearly at threshold, and then we need to explain why we have that particular experience versus another one. These are very complementary but important.
I guess what I want to push you, Mel.
I mean, everyone's going to agree with that, right? That a lot of this work in the lab is done with you're presenting things that are at the threshold so the person can barely see them. They're just visible because you want to get cases where it's visible and where it's not and contrast them. But we also want to understand what's happening when things are just like right now. I see everything out in the open. So I agree with that. I think everyone agrees with that.
And it is why 5 properties and not 6 or 3?
Axioms, yeah.
Like we debated for years. We have 1 plus 5.
Yeah, so we debated for years. I mean, that just goes to show you how contentious these are. They have what they think are the essential axioms, that consciousness. So she said 1 plus 5. I think the 1 is that consciousness exists, that it's a real thing that exists. So then you have these 5 other properties, that it's unified, informative. You have exclusion. I already said informative. What are the other 2? I don't know, but she's going to tell us. But you have those 1 plus 5 axioms. And it's not clear that these are the only ones you could have, or the ones that you would want. And I think, to me, that's one of the biggest criticisms of IIT, rather than all this other brouhaha that's going around, is that this choice of axioms clearly reflects that they have a first-order approach. They think consciousness doesn't require any kind of inner awareness. Maybe it doesn't. But I think that's an empirical question, and you shouldn't define your axioms that way. Yeah, okay, but let's hear her talk about the axioms.
I agree. You could debate as much as you want, but the question is, like, how do you...
It's not that the 5 is a magic, superstitious number. It's just like we came up with the fact that we have the first one is consciousness exists undeniably, and then there's those 5 properties that are immediate. You need introspection to come up to them, but once you have them, you can also see that they are also true for experiences where you're in the flow and you're not even thinking about it.
That's true, but let me just go back to...
Well, it's not true, I would say. So these 5 properties, you can make a case that many people find them intuitive, but can you really make a case that they show up in every part of our conscious experience? I don't really think you can without begging the question.
Because I think here's where the divide starts, right? So then Steve says, unification, for instance, works for the humans, but it might not actually work for other systems. So
well, it's not even clear it works for humans, unification. There are binding errors. It's not clear that this is something that's required for conscious experience, as opposed to just kind of ordinarily is there.
IIT is trying to explain humans and perhaps other systems in terms of inference. Then how do we do that? Does this mean that these 5 properties cannot be of any experience? It can just be circumscribed only to human experiences.
So the way to test the theory is actually also to kind of have a critical, in a way, reflection about the data you have. And that's where I was saying that the best data we have in for subjective experience, the quality of it, of course, we all agree the fullest reports we have, the richest are in humans. But then also we have invaluable data in terms of mechanisms with the work, kind of at the dendritic level, the optogenetic in other animals. And this is a part of the scientific, process, I would say, to actually critically examine the kind of evidence you have. Same like neuroimaging versus lesion studies, I often talk about that, right? It's actually a very interesting and fruitful process to see actually how much you can infer in a, computer. I wouldn't trust so much a computer telling me, oh, I am conscious now of that, compared to a human. This is the kind of thing you have to have as a general process, is a reflection about the the level of evidence you would have in a way, the trust you can give in the data you get.
But just to follow up on Lucia's question, so could there...
Yeah, I don't really understand what what her response was there. Let's go back.
It can just be circumscribed only to trying to explain humans and perhaps other systems in terms of inference. Then how do we do that? Does this mean that these 5 properties?
Oh, okay. So I think maybe, Lucia's saying that there could be other systems. Does she mean like AI systems? Or non-human animals? Because I think they're going to take very different approaches from IIT's point of view. So IIT is going to say, this is something I talked to Christoph Koch about in my Consciousness Live when he came on. It's like, why do you think computers won't be conscious? Well, they don't have the right kind of integrated information. Even if you simulated something that had that kind of integrated information, he thinks it's not going to be conscious. So we don't need to worry about them, even according to IIT. Even if the AI systems are saying I'm conscious, they can't be on IIT. They don't have the right kind of structure at the base level. Okay, so you can think whatever you want about that, but that's their view. So is that what her first part of the answer was about? Was that even if a thing tells you, it doesn't mean, so you have to be careful. And you can still do things in animals with like autogenetics and stuff. Let me re-listen to her answer.
This cannot be of any experience. It can just be circumscribed only to human experiences.
So the way to test a theory is actually also to kind of have a critical, in a way, reflection about the data you have. And that's where I was saying that the best data we have in like for subjective experience, the quality of it, of course, we all agree the fullest reports we have, the richest are in humans. But then also we have invaluable data in terms of mechanism.
Okay, so humans have subjective reports that gives us data about what consciousness is like. Okay.
With the work, kind of at the dendritic level, the optogenetic in other animals. And this is a part of the scientific, process, I would say, to actually critically examine the kind of evidence you have. Same like neuroimaging versus lesion studies, I often talk about that, right? It's actually a very interesting and fruitful process to see actually how much you can infer in a, computer. I wouldn't trust so much a computer telling me, oh, I am conscious now of that, compared to a human. This is the kind of thing you have to have as a general processes.
Oh, maybe I misunderstood her computer thing. So with lesions versus MRI, someone with kind of the computer, namely an MRI, telling me I had a certain experience. I'm not...
Computer, I wouldn't trust so much a computer telling me, oh, I am conscious now of that, compared to a human. This is the kind of thing you have to have as a general processes, a reflection about the level of evidence you would have in a way, the trust you can give in the data you get.
But just to follow...
Is she saying I wouldn't trust a computer telling me it was conscious, or is she saying I wouldn't trust a computer telling me I'm conscious? Well, let's see what the follow-up is, because I'm sort of lost on what her answer is.
Up on Lucia's question, so could there be a fallacy of the direction of inference in this case? So you start with I think it's a beautiful movie. Says I start with phenomenology, and then I ask what are the necessary conditions for these axioms to take place, and then you come up with these conditions, and then you look at the brain and you can ask, okay, so where in the brain do we have that conditions? But IIT seems to be wanting to do more and saying if you show me a system that has these conditions like phi, it is conscious. And maybe here you're inferring from if P then Q, you're now wanting to make the claim then if Q then P.
So we distinguish.
So if you're conscious, then you have phi. From that to, so confusing a necessary condition for a sufficient condition is what she's saying in philosopher lingo. So if you discover that if you're conscious, then you have phi, and then you infer from that, aha, if you have phi, then you're conscious. You're doing this kind of fallacy. But that's not what they're doing, is it? I don't think that's what they're doing. But let's hear the response.
3 different kind of ways a theory can be useful. One way is explaining known facts about consciousness in the brain, okay? And these are like, you don't need necessarily to perform experiments. These are things you need to account. Yeah, like the feedback or like things on which we would all agree. Yeah, so you need to have an explanation for that. The second one is actually come up with counterintuitive predictions that can be tested, like prospectively in experiments. But I also realized that we cannot test a theory on everything. There are some situations where, again, like in machines, how can I test if my theory is right or wrong in machines? I can't. I mean, it's just too far away from me for me to have enough confidence in the data I get about their, reports, or even if they were experiencing things or not.
Wait, she's saying you can't even test the theory there because they're too far. So she was saying what I sort of thought about the computer. The computer can't ever give us, according to her, reliable evidence that it's conscious because it's too far away from our own case. Interesting. I mean, myself personally, I've always tried to harbor the I've always been a secret admirer of the view that maybe consciousness is biological. That's why I like the identity theory that I defend often, although I'm not committed to it 100%. As you know, I spread my credences around and keep my mind open. However, I do have some proclivity towards the view that consciousness is a biological phenomenon, that there's something distinctly biological about it. And when I first heard about IET, I thought, oh, gee, this might be a way to get there. But then the more you learn about you realize the biology is not what's important to these guys. It's this integrated information stuff. So I'm getting distracted. But anyway, the point is that I'm very friendly to the view that computers might not be able to have consciousness. But it's hard to really maintain that view without giving some kind of principled reason why modeling the system wouldn't, and producing the same behavior, doing exactly what the system is doing, wouldn't produce the same results. So obviously there's the old line about, what does Bernardo Kastrup say? Simulating a kidney wouldn't make a computer pee on the desk. And Searle says simulating a hurricane in the computer doesn't make your desk wet. So, of course, if you were in the simulation, your desk would be wet. If the desk was a simulated desk, then the simulated hurricane would do something to it. So there's sort of a problem with that there. But yeah, anyway, so David Chalmers was talking recently about whether he thought large language models might have some kind of rudimentary form of consciousness. Well, not sensory consciousness, but whether you can have a kind of cognitive form of consciousness that maybe even these systems could have. She's saying that there would be no reason to ever take that seriously because they're just too different from us. Even someone like me, who's very friendly to that view, finds this a bit too much. And I have to admit that I've kind of, just as I've come to weaken and soften on compatibilism over time and come to realize that it is reasonable and it's not my preferred view, but it's not completely idiotic either. I think the same is true for functionalism. For a long time I felt that way about functionalism, and now I sort of recognize that it's not my preferred view, but nature doesn't give a shit about what I prefer. Okay, interesting. So she takes an even more hard line, because the line that I heard Christoph taking was just that IIT says there's no consciousness in computers. I love IIT, therefore no consciousness in computers. That's Christoph. She's saying it's not even about IIT, it's just that computers are too different from us, so we can't even take what they say at face value. I think that's an interesting critique, but I don't know how much I buy it.
That's also like, we talked about babies, like, okay, is it 3 cells, 5 cells, like when does it come up? This is a level of inference because the systems are so alien, or octopi, or all these, yeah?
Babies are alien? I mean, they are, let's face it. Yeah, people take the babies thing very seriously. I'm now remembering, I think I saw something on Twitter, back when I was on Twitter before it was shitter. Someone was very upset by what someone said about babies. Maybe it was here. I think it was at the ASSC. But people take babies very seriously. They certainly seem conscious. There's no reason to think from common sense that babies lack phenomenal consciousness. Scientists have said things. Doctors, didn't give anesthesia to newborn infants that were circumcised because they didn't think they really felt pain. Now they do. So there's a debate about when do you start to have conscious experiences. And the consensus view is that it's not right at birth, but that view is hard to maintain, actually, I would say. I mean, it's not ludicrous to think that babies don't have experience when they're first born. Being around them tends to convince you that they do, but then again, there's good evolutionary reasons why that might happen, so you can tell a debunking story about it. That seems reasonably okay. On the other hand, I don't think babies are that alien. A lot of their brain hasn't developed, but a lot of it is developed. So anyway, interesting. I mean, I get the tension, what she's saying. And I agree that we don't want to go right to these hard cases. We want to start with the human case and develop theories of consciousness there, test them. And then once we have a reasonable grasp on what's going on in the human case, we can start expanding outwards. And that's going to come, not obviously, it's a lot of problems, I think, going from even person to person, let alone from humans to octopus or to cat. So I think it's difficult, and a lot of people don't really appreciate how difficult it is. But that's a different question.
These are inferences where you won't be able to test the theory of consciousness confidently on that. But then if you have a theory that at some point comes up, explain known facts about consciousness in the brain, and then comes up with some predictions like we did with TMS-EEG and many others to be done, to challenge it, and it survives. You can never, in principle, prove a theory 100% true. It's going to be a good explanation or a bad one. You won't have the best explanation, but at least it's useful, because then, and I'm taking this very seriously also for coma patients, as you know. This is why I move more to theory, because I really care about having my best bed possible to infer if I have a person behind the stair in front of me in that bed, and make decisions for the care in the most ethical way. These are inferences, yeah? And these are different things a theory can be useful for, but it's very important to distinguish between them. That's what I would say.
So, but yeah, I think.
Yeah, so interesting. So you don't test it. So her view is you don't test a theory on those hard cases. And that's sort of what I was saying already. So I think that we agree with this. I just don't think that the evidence supports IIT in the way that she does. I also don't think it supports any other theories in the way that a lot of other people do. I think that the jury's out on a lot of this. But okay, she seems a little angry about the question, though, to be honest. Her body language seems aggressive.
You're making a.
But maybe that's just me. I just misinterpreting. Maybe she's not. I don't know her at all, actually. So who knows? I shouldn't have said that.
Very, very good point. And one of the things that we want to do with the adversarial collaborations, in fact, to then try to, put the theories in, to compete in some sense, just to see like what they can explain, right? Because in some sense, now if you take, for instance, how much, you can take the GNW, it also explains a lot of the evidence that we have for comatose patients. So you could have started at a different starting point and end up in the same place. So it's not. So I think we need to make that distinction, for the community, because ultimately, we can explain a lot of stuff, but our starting points are different.
And there, it's again important to have a critical evaluation of the evidence you have. So patients in a vegetative state, they don't respond to you.
Correct.
They are typically in unresponsive weakness syndrome, but it's not because that they don't respond to you that you can say they're unconscious, right?
Yeah.
So that's where I'm saying in these patients, it's in the level of inference, being imagined playing tennis or TMS-EEG or others, but we're actually using other criteria. We don't have access to subjective reports, which is our gold standard to infer, consciousness in the third person, right? So we need, at this point, I can't trust behavior if I have no signs of consciousness. I have to rely on other criteria. And so that's why I'm saying this kind of evidence, is this kind of claims or kind of you need to look at the big picture in order to investigate, what are your markers for consciousness. Now, that said, TMS-EEG says that minimally conscious patients, 95% of them show high PCI. So that's, it looks like if you have a positive evidence for non-reflexive behavior, it's a good indication consciousness is present. But the contrary is not true, and you have, again, to have a critical reflection about that, which is also why I moved from coma research to theoretical level, and looking at other states to then come back to them and do the best I can to infer it.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So this is very interesting. So the case that they're talking about is, people, they seem like they're in a coma, you put them in the MRI, you ask them to imagine things. Many people, they show no sign, they stay their brain seems the same. Some of these patients, they have what almost looks like regular brain activity when you ask them to imagine playing tennis. The motor cortex responds in a way that it does almost like in healthy patients when you ask them the same thing. So are they phenomenally conscious? It seems like they're aware in some sense of what you asked them to do. Imagine playing tennis, walk through your house. But do they experience it? Of course, we're not them, so we don't know. I agree, this is the important question. It's very important. If you're that person who's trapped inside, that would be horrible. If you're just a robot who's not really in there, so to speak, and going through emotions, that's a different story. So what was her saying about that, though? Because, so she's saying you make an inference about whether they're conscious or not. I agree with that. You have to have a theory that helps you make those judgments. What she's saying is that IIT, I think, she relies on that theory because she feels it's been verified elsewhere. But hold on.
What are your markers for consciousness? Now, that said, TMSET says that minimally conscious patients, 95% of them show high PCI. So that's, it looks like if you have a positive evidence for non-reflexive behavior, it's a good indication consciousness is present. But the contrary is not true. And you have, again, to have a critical reflection about that, which is also...
Wait, hold on. If you have non-responsive behavior, consciousness is present. Non-reflexive behavior. But if you don't, if it's absent, then what's she just say?
Conscious patients, 95% of them show high PCI. So
that's going to be evidence that they have consciousness, according to her?
It looks like if you have a positive evidence for non-reflexive behavior, it's a good indication consciousness.
Positive evidence for non-reflexive behavior indicates consciousness. But the opposite, if there's no behavior, then there's no consciousness. Take that with a grain of salt, but that's not the opposite. The opposite would be no consciousness, no behavior. Conditionals.
Present. But the contrary is not true. And you have, again, to have a critical reflection about that, which is also why I moved from coma research to theoretical level, and looking at other states to then come back to them and do the best I can to infer it.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So I want to end with you, Steve, because you're the only one who didn't tell us yet.
Sure.
Yeah.
So what was the original?
Oh, so I was right. Steve didn't actually say. I said this in the previous video. I was like, I wonder if they asked Steve. Okay, so this is like a good place to pause this, and we'll come back and finish this off. This has been very fun. Okay, cool. We'll be back.